The man at the end of the bar has not slept in 3 days. He came off the trail 2 hours ago, still smelling like cattle and river mud, and he has already put down 3 whiskeys without saying a word to anyone. He has a revolver on his hip, 2 months of pay in his pocket, and a temper that the trail sharpened into something dangerous. The man next to him owes somebody money. The man in the back is dealing cards to 4 cowboys who have been losing steadily for 40 minutes. The bartender has a short scattergun under the counter, a list of men who are cut off from credit, and a very clear sense of exactly when this room is about to go wrong. Now multiply this by every Friday night in every Kansas cattle town from the late 1860s through the 1880s. Abilene, Dodge City, Caldwell, Wichita, Ellsworth, towns where the entire economy turned on whether cowboys would spend their pay before they destroyed the place where they were spending it. Here is the paradox. The saloon was probably the most dangerous room in the American West. It combined alcohol with firearms, exhausted men with large sums of cash, strangers with old grudges, and a gambling economy with an honor culture where losing publicly could feel like a death sentence to a man's reputation. By every reasonable logic, frontier saloons should have been scenes of non-stop bloodshed. But most nights, they were not. Most nights the drinks poured, the cards turned, the music played, and the money moved from working men's pockets into house profits without a body on the floor. That did not happen by accident. It happened because of systems. Rough, expensive, often brutal systems, but systems all the same. The Hollywood version of a frontier saloon is a place of pure chaos, temporarily controlled by one fast gunfighter. Somebody insults somebody, chairs fly, a piano player ducks under the bench, and the town hero shoots the villain through a window. The room applauds. The bartender pours a celebratory round. That image is so far from the actual business of running a frontier saloon that it almost works in reverse. The real danger was not the gunfight. The real danger was the 30 things that happened before the gunfight. That, if managed correctly, made the gunfight unnecessary. A frontier saloon owner was running a business where the law was thin, the customers were armed, the suppliers were unreliable. The competition was 3 doors down. And the single most profitable night of the year, Payday, was also the night most likely to end with broken glass, dead customers, and a sheriff filing a report that could cost the owner his license. The rules that governed that room were not posted on a wall in most cases. They were enforced through reputation, architecture, staffing, local ordinances, bartender judgment, bouncer authority, and the quiet understanding that the house had more options than the average drunk cowboy did. Start with the room itself, because the physical design of a frontier saloon was its first line of control. Most serious saloons in cattle towns were built with this problem in mind. The bar ran along one wall or across the back, and the bartender stood behind it at all times. That position was not ceremonial, it was strategic. The bartender had a clear line of sight to every person in the room. He could see who was drinking fast, who was getting loud, who was reaching for something they should not, and who was 3 drinks past the point where conversation was possible. He also had the counter as a physical barrier between himself and the customers, and under that counter, in most documented cases, was a weapon. A scattergun, a club, sometimes both. The bar counter was also a transaction point, and that mattered for control. Every drink required a moment of engagement between the bartender and the customer. A good bartender used those moments. He was reading the room constantly, and when a man came up for a refill, the bartender had a brief, socially acceptable opportunity to assess his condition, slow him down with conversation, or simply tell him the bottle was going to wait a few minutes. It was not therapy. It was inventory management applied to human beings. The architecture also addressed a problem that movies almost never acknowledge, and that is the problem of exits. Saloons with only one door were common in smaller towns and early settlements, and that design was not accidental. One door meant one point of surveillance. A man who wanted to leave with someone else's money, someone else's gun, or someone else's horse had to pass the bartender and any door staff to do it. Some frontier saloons, particularly in towns with active law enforcement like Dodge City during the cattle season, had arrangements where door staff would check that a man leaving alone was not being followed by someone who had been arguing with him 20 minutes earlier. Now here is where the myth starts falling apart. Most people assume that frontier saloons were open carry environments where every man wore his guns inside and nobody said a word about it. The reality depended heavily on the town, the year, and the local ordinance. By the mid-1870s, several major cattle towns had enacted weapon ordinances that required men to check their firearms when they came in from the trail. Abilene under Marshal Tom Smith in 1870, and later under James Butler Hickok in 1871, enforced carry restrictions with real consequences. Dodge City, in the years when Wyatt Earp served as assistant city marshal starting in 1876, maintained a deadline, which was a physical boundary usually marked by the railroad tracks, south of which a man was expected to surrender his weapons, or at least keep them holstered and visible until checked. Dodge actually posted signs at the edge of town in some years informing arriving cowboys of the ordinance. Whether that stopped everyone is a separate question, but the ordinance existed and was enforced. Saloons that operated under these ordinances, and many chose to enforce them even where the law did not require it, kept a check system for weapons. A man surrendered his revolver, received a token or a receipt, and collected his gun on the way out. The benefit to the saloon owner was not political goodwill. It was practical. A room full of men without weapons was a room where a fistfight was still very possible, but where a fatal outcome was much less likely. And a room where men survived their own bad decisions was a room those men could walk back into tomorrow night with money still in their pockets. Not every saloon used a check system. Smaller operations, roadhouses, and saloons in mining camps with no meaningful law enforcement often had no formal policy at all. In those environments, the rules were enforced by the bartender's personal authority, the physical presence of house muscle, and the reputation of the establishment. A man who started trouble in a known rough house understood that the response would be immediate. Which brings us to the bouncer, because the frontier version of this role has been almost completely stripped out of popular history. The movies give us bartenders and marshals. They skip the man standing near the door or in the corner, whose entire job was to be the first physical response to a problem before it escalated into something the bartender could not handle alone. The records on this are thinner than the records on law enforcement because bouncers rarely made the newspaper unless they killed someone, but their presence is documented in enough memoirs, court records, and town histories to make clear that serious saloons employed them as a regular operating cost. In Dodge City, certain high-volume establishments employed men who were known around town specifically for this purpose. These were not always large men. Size helped, but it was not the primary qualification. What mattered was a combination of physical capability, local reputation, and the judgment to know when to grab a man by the collar and walk him out versus when to wait for the situation to cool. A bouncer who escalated every minor argument into a physical confrontation was costing the house customers and money. A bouncer who waited too long was costing the house furniture, glassware, and occasionally staff. The cost of broken glassware and furniture was a real economic consideration, and not a trivial one. Frontier supply chains were slow and expensive. A case of whiskey glasses ordered from St. Louis could take weeks to arrive and cost a significant fraction of a week's profit. Some saloon owners built this into their math by using tin cups instead of glass in the rougher sections of their establishments. A tin cup that gets thrown across a room is a problem you pick up off the floor. And a glass that shatters is a problem you sweep up and then order replacements for. This is the kind of operational detail that separates a business making money from a business constantly spending it. The gambling operation inside a frontier saloon was its own system, with its own rules, and this is where the danger got genuinely complicated. Gambling was the engine of saloon profit in most serious establishments. Drinks brought men through the door. Gambling kept them there and extracted the large sums. A man who drank steadily for 2 hours might spend $3 to $5 in some cattle town saloons. A man at the card table could lose a month's wages in the same time. The house knew this. The gamblers who worked the house knew this. And the cowboys sitting down at the table mostly knew this too, even if they chose to ignore it. The gambling rules mattered because gambling disputes were the most common immediate cause of violence inside frontier saloons. The accusation of cheating was the match that lit more fires than any other single trigger. It was not just a financial complaint. In the honor culture of the frontier, calling a man a cheat was a direct assault on his character, and in a world where your word and your reputation were often the most reliable currency you had, that accusation could feel like an existential threat that demanded a physical response. House gamblers, the professional card players who worked for or alongside a saloon, operated under implicit and sometimes explicit rules about how disputes were to be handled. In a well-run establishment, the house gambler was expected to absorb accusations with a certain level of composure. Tentia, offer to reshuffle and replay a contested hand, or call the bartender over as a neutral authority. What he was not supposed to do in a house that wanted repeat customers was draw a weapon the moment a losing cowboy got loud. A dead cowboy at the card table was terrible for business in 3 separate ways. It ended the session for every other player at that table. It brought law enforcement attention to the establishment, and it sent a message to every other cowboy in town that this saloon was a place where you could die over a card game. That said, the records are clear that professional gamblers on the frontier were often armed, skilled with those arms, and willing to use them when they felt genuinely threatened. Doc Holliday, one of the more documented professional gamblers of the period, was known in multiple towns, including Dodge City and Tombstone, as a man of genuine physical danger. But Holliday's documented record of violence is actually more selective than his legend suggests. Most serious gamblers understood that their livelihood depended on their ability to sit at a table and take money from strangers night after night, and a man with a reputation for shooting customers over disputed hands would find those tables getting empty very fast. The dealer's physical positioning at the table was itself a rule. Professional gamblers almost universally sat with their back to a wall, facing the door. This was not superstition. It was a practical response to the fact that a man in debt or in a bad losing streak might decide that the simplest solution to his problem was behind him rather than in front of him. Sitting with your back exposed in a frontier saloon while holding a large amount of cash that had recently belonged to the men at your table was not a sustainable business practice. There was also a layer of credit management that the gambling operation depended on, and this connected directly to the wider saloon economy. Credit was a complicated problem in frontier saloons. Refusing credit entirely meant turning away cowboys who were broke on a Tuesday, but who would be paid the following Friday and would spend freely. Extending credit too liberally meant creating a population of men who owed the house money, and who might decide that the best response to that debt was to never come back. Or worse, to come back hostile. The better-run saloons kept informal ledgers. The bartender knew which faces were good for a short tab and which ones were problems. Men who were known to pay were extended modest credit during the week. Men who had a history of disappearing were served only for cash. But credit also created a different kind of danger that movies skip almost entirely. A man who is deeply in debt to a saloon is a man whose relationship with that establishment has changed. He is no longer just a customer. He is an obligation, and obligations in the frontier economy could be collected in ways that went well beyond a polite request for repayment. Some saloon owners in cattle towns had informal arrangements with local employers and trail bosses that allowed them to collect debts at the source before a cowboy ever got his full wages. A trail boss who was also a regular customer of a particular saloon had social and sometimes financial reasons to make sure his crew honored their debts before they got on the trail back south. This is documented thinly in trail memoirs, but it represents a layer of the system that popular history has almost entirely ignored. The relationship between a saloon and the local law enforcement was another system layer, and it was far more transactional than the movies suggest. In most cattle towns, the sheriff or town marshal was not an independent moral crusader. He was a public employee whose salary came from the town, and the town's economy depended directly on the cattle trade, which funneled through the saloons. A marshal who shut down every saloon in Dodge City the moment a fight broke out would have been replaced quickly by a marshal who understood the economics more clearly. The actual relationship between frontier law enforcement and saloon owners was usually something closer to a working arrangement. The saloon owners wanted visible law presence on payday nights because visible law reduced the severity of incidents. The marshal wanted saloons that cooperated with his authority because it made his job manageable. Neither party was pure, and neither was entirely corrupt. Wyatt Earp's time in Dodge City, which is documented extensively though not always accurately, illustrates this arrangement with reasonable clarity. Earp and his contemporaries enforced weapon ordinances, intervened in fights, and maintained a certain level of visible control during the cattle season. They were also known to the saloon owners, known to the gamblers, and operating in an environment where everybody understood that the goal was not the elimination of vice, but the management of it within boundaries that allowed the town to function and profit. Earp himself was a gambler and a saloon man, as well as a lawman, and that overlap was not unusual for the period. It was almost structural. The marshal's ability to control a saloon during a serious incident depended on two things: speed of response and credibility of force. A frontier marshal who arrived at a saloon after a man had already been shot was doing cleanup, not prevention. The saloons that had the fewest serious incidents were the ones where the house staff managed problems before they reached badge authority. The bartender stopped a man at drink 4 instead of drink 8. The bouncer redirected a brewing argument before it became a drawing argument. The house gambler settled a dispute with a refund rather than a challenge. The marshal showed up not to resolve a crisis, but to confirm that things were under control. Here is a detail that complicates the heroic narrative considerably. In several documented cases, saloon owners in Kansas cattle towns paid directly into the cost of law enforcement. Abilene's early cattle season saw the city council, which included men with direct financial interests in the saloon trade, vote on marshal salaries and equipment budgets. The men enforcing the rules were being paid by an economic system that depended on those rules being enforced just enough and not too much. A marshal who enforced too aggressively emptied the saloons and destroyed the town's revenue. A marshal who enforced too loosely allowed chaos that killed the town's ability to attract future cattle drives. That narrow zone between those two outcomes was the actual job. The reputation system that governed saloon behavior extended beyond individual establishments and individual lawmen. In cattle towns that depended on the annual drives from Texas, the reputation of the town itself was an economic asset. Reports of violence, theft, and lawlessness reached Texas ranchers and trail bosses through newspapers, returning cowboys, and the commercial networks of the cattle trade. A town with a reputation for eating cowboys alive, where a man could ride in with 2 months of wages and leave with nothing, was a town that trail bosses would begin routing around. The decision by Abilene citizens to shut down the cattle trade entirely in 1872 was partly moral and partly a recognition that the town had been paying a cost it could no longer absorb. The saloon economy required the cattle trade, and the cattle trade required a town that was dangerous enough to be entertaining and controlled enough to be survivable. Dodge City absorbed that lesson and managed its cattle trade years with somewhat more calculated control. The records from Dodge between 1875 and 1885 show a town that was genuinely rough, where men died and violence was common, but where the governing institutions maintained just enough function to keep the economic engine running. The famous Boot Hill Cemetery is sometimes cited as evidence of pure chaos, but the actual records suggest a more complicated story. Many of those deaths were the result of the system working as designed. Men who pushed past the rules got consequences, and those consequences were meant to be visible to everyone else. Some establishments employed men whose job was specifically to move through the room during peak hours as observers, not enforcers. A man counting his remaining money too often was a man about to become a problem. Two men at the bar, whose body language had shifted from friendly to tense, were two men who might need to be separated before they resolved to do it themselves. These informal observers reported to the house manager and allowed the establishment to intervene before a situation required a physical response. The whiskey served in frontier saloons was not uniform, and this mattered for control. Quality ranged from genuine distillery product brought in by rail to diluted grain alcohol flavored with tobacco, burnt sugar, and additives that had no place in a beverage and which had real effects on the speed and severity of intoxication. A cowboy who had been on the trail for 6 weeks with limited access to alcohol and who sat down to a glass of straight raw frontier whiskey was in a different condition than the average modern drinker after an hour of the same. Some saloon owners, particularly those with a longer-term economic view, Payday, understood that serving a man adulterated whiskey that put him on the floor in 40 minutes was actually worse for business than serving him something drinkable that kept him upright and spending for 3 hours. This is not sentimentality about saloon owners. It is basic business logic. A man who is functional is spending. A man who is incoherent is a liability. And a man who is incoherent and armed is a liability that could very quickly become an expense. The management of women who worked in frontier saloons added another layer of rules that the popular image either sanitizes or sensationalizes. Saloon women, the common term for women employed as entertainers, waitresses, or companions in frontier drinking establishments, were a real part of the economy of these spaces and also a real source of tension. Men who competed for their attention, men who became possessive, men who confused the professional friendliness of a saloon woman for something more personal, were a recurring management problem. Women who worked in serious establishments were protected, to a degree, by the house authority. A man who became physically threatening toward a saloon woman was usually removed, sometimes permanently. This was not generosity. A saloon that could not retain women workers lost a significant part of its revenue. Protecting the staff was protecting the investment. There were also rules about credit that applied specifically to cowboys in their final days in a cattle town. When the cattle had been sold, the trail boss had paid out, and the men were preparing to head back south. This was the highest risk window for the saloon economy. A cowboy with a full month's wages and a departure date 2 days out had a limited time to lose his money. The house rules in this window were often more aggressive about extending credit, about keeping games running, and about making sure the man with money found things to spend it on before he and his wages left Kansas together. It was not subtle, and most of the people involved understood exactly what was happening. This is where the saloon economy connected directly to the broader cattle town economy, and where the exploitation became most visible. Cowboys on the Chisholm Trail in the late 1860s and early 1870s were earning roughly $25 to $40 a month, depending on their position. After 2 to 3 months on the trail, a working cowboy might arrive in Abilene or Dodge with $50 to $100 in his pocket, which, in the context of the period, was meaningful money. The cattle town was architecturally and economically designed to take as much of that money as possible in the shortest available time. Saloons, gambling, hotels, laundries, and clothing merchants all competed for the cowboy dollar simultaneously. The records suggest that many cowboys returned south with very little left. The violence that did happen in frontier saloons was rarely the clean, fast draw showdown of movie mythology. The documented incidents that historians have cross-referenced through court records, newspaper accounts, and inquest reports tend to follow a different pattern. Most fatal incidents in saloons were the result of men who already knew each other or had a pre-existing grievance, of situations that had been building through the evening rather than erupting from nothing, and of moments where the house control system failed at a specific point rather than collapsing all at once. The bartender was occupied. The bouncer was dealing with something in the back. The marshal was a block away. The moment lasted 3 seconds, and the consequences lasted years. The most famous incidents at Dodge City, Tombstone, and Abilene are famous partly because they were unusual. The OK Corral gunfight in October of 1881 remains one of the most written about events in American Western history. But its notoriety comes precisely from the fact that such a confrontation was genuinely not an everyday occurrence. What happened every day was the quieter enforcement of the rules that kept most encounters from reaching that outcome. The system had costs that the participants understood clearly, even if they rarely articulated them. Bartenders who worked payday nights in Dodge City during peak cattle season were working in conditions of genuine physical risk for wages that records suggest were modest relative to that risk. They managed intoxicated armed men, made credit decisions under pressure, and served as the primary authority in the room during hours when the law was stretched thin. The job required physical courage, social intelligence, and genuine patience that is not well represented in the popular image of the man polishing a glass behind the bar. Trail bosses who brought their crews into town had their own version of this problem. A trail boss who lost half his crew to jail, injury, or permanent departure during a cattle town stop had a serious operational problem. The return trip south still required men, horses, and functional organization, and some trail bosses made informal agreements with saloon owners before their crews hit town about credit limits and which men were to be cut off early. You're standing at the bar on a Friday night in Dodge City in 1878. You have been on the trail since April. You smell like the Cimarron River, and you have not been in a room with a roof since before the Indian Territory crossing. You have $42 in your pocket and a revolver on your hip that the city ordinance technically required you to check at the edge of town. The bartender puts a glass in front of you and looks at you for exactly the amount of time it takes to decide something. You do not know what he decided. You find out later when he stops at your end of the bar a little more often than he does for other men, or when he does not, or when the man near the door is standing with his arms loose in a specific way that you recognize as professional attention. You are inside a system. It is not comfortable. It is not clean. It is absolutely not what the movies made it look like. But it is working tonight, and the proof is that tomorrow morning you will wake up somewhere, broke almost certainly, possibly hurt, but alive. The system worked most nights because every layer was responding to the same core problem from a different angle. The architecture controlled sight lines. The bartender controlled pace and credit. The house muscle controlled escalation. The weapon ordinances reduced the lethality of incidents when control failed. The marshal provided an outside authority that the house could call on when its own authority was insufficient. The reputation of the town controlled the long-term behavior of the cattle trade, and the reputation of the individual cowboy, which he carried with him up the trail and back down it, controlled his behavior in the room, because he knew that what he did in Dodge was what he would be known for when he rode back into Texas. The myth of the Wild West Saloon is a story about individual heroism in a space of pure freedom. The truth is nearly the opposite. The Frontier Saloon was a highly managed commercial environment, operating under constant threat, run by people who had learned through painful experience exactly how much freedom their customers could be allowed before the room stopped being profitable and started being a crime scene. The rules were brutal because the problem was brutal. The men running those rooms were not romantic. They were businessmen in a dangerous industry solving a practical problem every single night. And most nights, at a cost that the history books have mostly forgotten to count, they solved it. The last thing a well-run frontier saloon needed was a gunfight. The last thing it ever got credit for was preventing one.